The small town of Clearwater, Montana, had forgotten what war looked like. By the spring of 1943, it was just another collection of wooden houses, a general store, and a church with a crooked steeple. The mountains surrounding it held secrets older than any living soul could remember, and the people who lived there preferred it that way. They worked the land, raised their children, and pretended the world beyond their valley did not exist. But Henry Caldwell knew better. At 63 years old, Henry was a relic from another era. His back was bent from decades of labor. His hands were gnarled like the roots of an ancient oak, and his eyes carried the weight of things no man should ever witness. The townspeople called him Old Soldier, though never to his face. They saw him as a curiosity, a leftover from the Great War who spent his days tending a small vegetable garden behind his cabin, and his nights sitting on the porch with a pipe that never seemed to go out. What they did not know was that Henry Caldwell had been more than just a soldier. He had been a scout, a strategist, a man who understood that wars were won not only with bullets but with patience, observation, and the kind of cunning that came from surviving when survival seemed impossible. He had fought in the trenches of France, watched friends die in the mud, and learned that the human spirit could endure almost anything if it had a reason to keep fighting. Now all he wanted was peace. His daughter, Margaret, visited every Sunday with her husband, Thomas, and their 2 boys, James and Samuel. She worried about him living alone in the cabin at the edge of town, but Henry always waved off her concerns with a grunt and a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He liked the quiet. He liked the solitude. He liked knowing that the worst was behind him. Until the day it was not. It started with rumors. Whispers in the general store about strange men seen in the woods. Tracks that did not belong to any local hunter. A few missing livestock that folks blamed on wolves, though the wounds did not look like any wolf Henry had ever seen. The sheriff, a portly man named Dutch Harrington, dismissed it all as paranoia. After all, Montana was far from any coast, far from any strategic importance. What would enemies of America want with Clearwater? Henry knew the answer before anyone else did. He had seen the pattern before, decades ago in another country. The way information moved. The way fear crept into a community like frost on a window. The way people convinced themselves they were safe right up until the moment they were not. He started paying attention. One evening in late April, Henry was chopping wood behind his cabin when he heard voices. They were faint, carried on the wind from somewhere deeper in the forest. He set down his axe and stood perfectly still, letting his ears do the work his eyes could not. The language was not English. It was clipped, efficient German. Henry felt something cold settle in his chest. He moved through the trees like a shadow, each step deliberate and silent. Years fell away with every breath. His back straightened. His hands stopped shaking. The old soldier woke up. What he found confirmed his worst fears. 12 men, dressed in civilian clothes but moving with military precision, had set up a camp in a cave system about 2 miles from town. They had maps, radio equipment, and enough supplies to suggest they had been there for weeks. Henry watched them from a distance, noting their routines, their hierarchy, the way they checked the trails and marked certain locations on their maps. They were scouts, advance units sent to gather intelligence on infrastructure, resources, potential sabotage targets. Clearwater was not random. The town sat near a rail line that carried supplies west to support the war effort. Destroy that line, and you disrupted everything from troop movements to ammunition shipments. These men were not here to attack. Not yet. They were here to prepare the way for something much worse. Henry crawled backward through the underbrush until he was certain they could not hear him, then made his way back to his cabin. His mind was already working through possibilities, scenarios, risks. He could go to Sheriff Harrington, but what proof did he have? The word of an old man who still had nightmares about a war that ended 25 years ago? By the time anyone believed him, it might be too late. No, this was something he had to handle himself. That night, Henry sat at his kitchen table and stared at the objects laid out before him. An old canteen from his days in the trenches, a tin of kerosene, a small vial of rat poison he kept for the vermin that sometimes got into his shed, and a leather pouch filled with dried mushrooms he had gathered from the forest. the kind the old Blackfeet hunters had taught him to avoid because they caused violent sickness. The townspeople called him an old soldier, a man whose time had passed. They had no idea what he was capable of. Henry spent the next 3 days studying the Nazi scouts like a scientist observing a dangerous species. He mapped their patrol routes, timed their shift changes, and noted which man seemed to be in command. The leader was tall, blond, with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. He spoke rarely, but when he did, the others listened with the kind of attention that came from fear rather than respect. On the 4th day, Henry noticed something crucial. The scouts had established a water source about half a mile from their cave, a small spring that bubbled up from between 2 moss-covered rocks. Every morning at dawn, 2 men would make the trip with canteens, fill them, and return to camp. It was their only mistake, the single point of vulnerability in an otherwise disciplined operation. Henry knew he had one chance, but doubt crept in during the quiet moments. His hands shook more than they used to. His knees ached when he crouched for too long. He was not the man he had been in 1918, not the young soldier who could march 20 miles and still have energy to dig a trench. He was old, worn down by time and memory, and the weight of what he was planning pressed against his chest like a stone. What if he failed? What if they caught him? The Nazis would not just kill him. They would torture him for information, then move on to the town, to Margaret and her family, to everyone he had ever known. The risk was enormous, the margin for error non-existent. On the 5th night, Henry sat on his porch and watched the stars appear one by one over the mountains. He thought about the men he had served with in France, the ones who never came home, the ones whose names were carved into monuments that most people walked past without a second glance. He thought about his wife, Eleanor, who had died of pneumonia in 1937, and how she used to tell him that some men were born to stand between the innocent and the darkness, whether they wanted to or not. He thought about James and Samuel, his grandsons, who played in these woods and fished in these streams, and believed the world was a safe place because no one had ever given them reason to think otherwise. Henry stood up, his decision made. He gathered his materials, the rusted canteen that had accompanied him through the trenches of Verdun, now covered in oxidized metal that flaked off at the slightest touch, the dried mushrooms, ground into a fine powder, the rat poison, colorless and odorless. He mixed them carefully in the dim light of a kerosene lamp, creating a substance that would dissolve in water, taste like nothing, and within hours turn a man's insides into a battlefield his own body could not win. The old soldier was going to war one last time, and this time he was fighting alone. Henry moved through the pre-dawn darkness like a ghost returning to familiar ground. The forest was silent except for the occasional hoot of an owl and the whisper of wind through pine branches. He carried the poisoned canteen in a canvas bag, along with a knife he had kept sharp for 25 years and never hoped to use again. He reached the spring 30 minutes before the scouts were scheduled to arrive. The water bubbled clear and cold from between the rocks, innocent and life-giving. Henry knelt beside it and carefully poured the contents of his canteen into the pool where the spring collected before flowing downstream. The powder dissolved instantly, leaving no trace, no smell, nothing to suggest the water was anything other than what it had always been. Then came the waiting. Henry positioned himself behind a fallen log about 40 yards upwind, his body pressed flat against the earth, his breathing slow and controlled. This was the part he remembered most clearly from the war. The terrible patience required to lie perfectly still while your heart hammered against your ribs and every instinct screamed at you to move, to run, to do anything but wait. The first rays of sunlight were painting the sky pale orange when he heard them. 2 voices speaking German in low tones, boots crunching on the forest floor. Henry did not move, did not blink. He watched through the gaps in the log as 2 men emerged into the clearing, both young, maybe 25 at most, carrying 4 canteens each. They knelt by the spring without hesitation, without suspicion. One of them made a joke Henry could not understand, and the other laughed. They filled the canteens one by one, the water splashing and gurgling with a sound that seemed obscenely cheerful given what Henry had just done. When they finished, they stood, shouldered their load, and walked back toward the cave. Henry waited until their footsteps faded completely, then counted to 200 before moving. His knees protested as he rose, but he ignored them. The hard part was done. Now came the harder part, waiting to see if it would work. Henry returned to his cabin and went through the motions of a normal day. He fed his chickens, worked in his garden, sat on his porch with his pipe. But his mind was miles away, calculating, worrying, hoping. If the poison worked too quickly, they might realize what happened and evacuate. If it worked too slowly, they might discover the source and adapt. The timing had to be perfect. If you are hoping this old soldier succeeds, take a moment now and stay with this story. What happens next will change everything, not just for Henry, but for everyone in Clearwater. By noon, Henry heard the first scream from the direction of the forest. Then another. Then silence that was somehow worse than any sound. Henry did not move from his porch. He sat with his pipe, listening to the sounds that drifted through the forest like echoes from a nightmare he thought he had left behind. Shouting in German. The crack of branches as men stumbled through the underbrush. More screaming, desperate and animal, the kind that came when the body turned against itself. By mid-afternoon, the forest had gone quiet again. Henry waited until dusk before making his way back through the trees. He moved carefully, knowing that even poisoned and dying, desperate men were dangerous. The forest felt different now, heavy with something that had not been there before. Death had a smell Henry recognized, metallic and sweet and wrong. He found the first body about 100 yards from the cave entrance. One of the young men who had fetched the water that morning. He was curled on his side, his face gray, his eyes open and staring at nothing. Foam had dried at the corners of his mouth. Henry felt nothing as he looked down at him. No satisfaction, no remorse, just the cold acknowledgement that this was the cost of protecting what mattered. The cave entrance revealed the rest. Bodies sprawled in various positions, some having made it only a few steps before collapsing, others having crawled toward the radio equipment as if calling for help could save them. The tall leader with the scar lay near the back, one hand still gripping a map of Montana rail lines, the other clutched around his throat. 12 men, all dead, all because an old soldier remembered lessons learned in mud and blood a quarter-century ago. Henry worked quickly. He gathered their maps, their radio codes, their identification papers, everything that proved who they were and what they had been planning. Then he doused the cave entrance with the kerosene he had brought and struck a match. The flames caught immediately, hungry and bright, consuming evidence and bodies alike. He stood and watched it burn, the firelight dancing across his weathered face. Somewhere in his chest, something that had been clenched tight for 25 years finally loosened. He had not failed. He had not been too old, too slow, too broken by time and memory. When it mattered most, the soldier was still there. The walk back to his cabin felt shorter than it ever had before. 3 days later, when a military intelligence unit arrived in Clearwater asking questions about reported Nazi activity in the region, Henry handed over the documents he had taken from the cave. He told them about the bodies in the burned-out cave, about the water source, about everything except the rusted canteen and what he had put in it. The officer in charge, a colonel named Patterson, studied Henry for a long moment. Then he shook the old man's hand and said nothing more needed to be said. Some wars were fought in public, others in shadow. Both mattered equally. The official report stated that 12 enemy operatives had been neutralized during a covert military operation in the Montana wilderness. No mention was made of Clearwater, no mention of an old soldier with a rusted canteen, no mention of poison or springs or the kind of quiet courage that never made it into newspapers. Colonel Patterson returned twice more over the following weeks, always alone, always bringing documents that required Henry's signature. Non-disclosure agreements. Security clearances that meant nothing to a man who had no intention of speaking anyway. On his final visit, Patterson sat on Henry's porch and accepted a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed with creek water and determination. "You saved lives," the colonel said, staring out at the mountains. "More than you know. We found evidence they were planning coordinated attacks on 3 different rail lines. If they had succeeded, our supply chains would have been crippled for months. Thousands of our boys overseas would have paid the price. Henry said nothing. He had learned long ago that some actions did not require words. Patterson stood to leave, then paused at the steps. The country owes you a debt it can never repay. But it will also never acknowledge. I hope you can live with that. Henry met his eyes. I lived with worse. After Patterson left, life in Clearwater returned to its familiar rhythms. The townspeople never knew how close they had come to disaster. Sheriff Harrington took credit for reporting suspicious activity to federal authorities, and Henry let him. Margaret continued her Sunday visits, bringing her boys who ran through the forest without fear because the monsters that had been lurking there were gone. Only once did Margaret ask about the military vehicles she had seen on the road, the men in uniform who had visited her father's cabin. Henry told her it was nothing, just old business from the war being settled, paperwork that had finally caught up with him after all these years. She looked at him with eyes that reminded him so much of Eleanor it made his chest ache. "You would tell me if something was wrong," she said. It was not quite a question. Henry smiled, the first genuine smile he had managed in weeks. Everything is exactly as it should be. That night, he took the rusted canteen from where he had hidden it beneath the floorboards of his cabin. He walked to the edge of his property where the land dropped away into a ravine, and he threw it as far as his old arm could manage. It disappeared into the darkness with a distant clatter, taking with it the last physical evidence of what he had done. Some tools were meant to be used only once. Some men were meant to stand between the darkness and the light, even when no one would ever know they had been there. Henry Caldwell was both. And for the first time in 25 years, he slept without nightmares. August 1955. 12 years later, the town of Clearwater had grown in the years since the war ended. New houses lined streets that had once been dirt paths. The general store had been replaced by a proper market. Young families had moved in, drawn by the promise of clean air and mountain views, unaware that the peace they enjoyed had been purchased with poison and silence. Henry Caldwell was 75 years old now, his hair completely white, his movements slower but still deliberate. He spent his mornings in the garden and his afternoons on the porch, watching his grandsons, now young men themselves, help him with repairs around the cabin. James was studying engineering at the State University. Samuel had joined the Air Force, following in his grandfather's footsteps, though he did not quite understand the weight that path carried. Margaret visited more frequently now, worried about her father living alone at his age. But Henry was content. He had lived longer than most men from his generation, longer than he had any right to expect after everything he had seen and done. On a warm afternoon in late summer, a car pulled up the long driveway to his cabin. Henry recognized the driver immediately, though Colonel Patterson was older now, gray at the temples, wearing civilian clothes instead of a uniform. He had retired from the military 3 years prior, but still carried himself like a man who had spent his life making impossible decisions. They sat on the porch without speaking for several minutes, two old soldiers watching the sun move across the mountains. Finally, Patterson spoke. "I wanted you to know that the full story was declassified last month. Not for public release, but it is in the archives now. What you did, how you did it. Someday, when we are both long gone, someone will read that file and understand what one man with nothing but courage and a rusted canteen accomplished." Henry nodded slowly. "Will it mention the nightmares?" Patterson turned to look at him. "Does it still bother you?" "Every war bothers you," Henry said quietly. "The ones you fight and the ones you prevent. The difference is learning to carry the weight without letting it crush you." They talked until sunset, two men who had lived through different hells but understood the same truth. That freedom was never free. That peace required guardians willing to do terrible things in the dark so others could live safely in the light. When Patterson finally left, Henry remained on his porch as stars began appearing overhead. He thought about the 12 men in the cave, about the lives saved, about the grandsons who would never know their grandfather was once called upon to be more than just an old soldier. He had no regrets. Thank you for staying until the end of Henry's story. If this tale moved you, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories of unsung heroes who changed history in ways the world never knew. What story should we tell next? Let us know below. Henry Caldwell passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1959. Surrounded by family, his secret safe, his duty fulfilled.